Thank you all for being here. I just want to say I live on Wadi Wadi country from the Dharawal Nation, and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, because it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. And as Anna was saying, I'm a practicing artist, so as I speak, I've got some pictures of work that I've done that really sort of address some of the issues. And I must say some of this feels very simplified, so I'm sorry if I'm sort of teaching you to suck eggs. So I've witnessed violence and discrimination against women on the basis of their sex class, where sex is defined by the United Nations as the physical and biological characteristics that distinguish males from females. The rights of women, as set out in the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, are both sex-based. Sex and gender are not interchangeable terms. Sex is biological and unchangeable. Every cell in a human body is sex. Gender is a social construct that uses stereotypes divided into masculine and feminine binaries to control populations. And these gender stereotypes manifest differently across the globe. Gender identity attempts to make these socially constructed stereotypes into essential and innate conditions, and this undermines women's sex-based rights. This art piece is called What Value a Stitch, and it's about the gender pay gap of 18.8%. So 18.8% is missing from the fingers and the gloves and the dollar coin. And the words on the beads between the hands say a long way from revolution. So after listening to women's descriptions of what's happened to them over 45 years, it's clear to me that rape, abuse and violence are tools of the patriarchy used to control women on the basis of their sex. And the state is complicit in these acts against the human rights of women. And I represent that in this watercolour on the right by the Australian Commonwealth coat of arms covering the eyes of the female-formed lamb. My experience has shown me that the tactics of the trans rights activists are similar to the tactics of the male perpetrators of abuse and of men's rights activists. I want to acknowledge that lesbians have been bearing the brunt of this war for the past 30 years. I was active with COAL, as was said, and the Coalition of Activist Lesbians has UN status, ECOSOC status, and was active working in the human rights of lesbians, as in same-sex attraction between women, which is called in CEDAW sexual orientation. So I've worked as a lesbian health worker in 2 women's health centres in New South Wales, and I've heard many stories of violence and discrimination based on their lesbian lives. Lesbians have been colonised by the alphabet soup. We were not consulted, nor did we consent to being bound to gender identity ideology. Men claim they can be lesbians by saying their gender identity is female and that is more important than biology. They're saying a lesbian can have a penis. They insist lesbian sex can include male genitalia, and this undermines the sex-based rights of lesbians and is a form of sexual coercion. So including men in the definitions of women leads to the destruction of lesbian culture, and that's a culture that's been built over decades through women-only spaces, music, art, discussions and social activities. And gender identity politics claims males should have access to lesbian spaces if they say that they're women. So trans rights activists are trying to redefine what a lesbian is, and they're demanding that we agree with them. It's a form of cultural genocide for lesbians. Due to collisions with the trans rights activists, most of the lesbian spaces in Australia have gone, including the Sydney Lesbian Space Project, which was a cultural centre, a 2-storey building which has been sold and split our once vibrant lesbian community. The annual National Lesbian Festivals are now not possible because trans-identified males sued lesbians via the state anti-discrimination tribunals. Sydney Lesbian Open House has stopped running after a trans-identified male physically assaulted a lesbian outside the gathering, intimidating other lesbians from attending. Whatever happened to freedom of association? The Rainbow Mob spread lies and misinformation, including that you can change your sex, telling young gender non-conforming lesbians that they're really men, lying about radical feminists and accusing us of hate speech and violence. Young lesbians are denied seeing lesbians living lives free of men. The rights of the child are being ignored, while the trans rights activists use transing kids in an attempt to legitimise their unproven assertion that gender is innate. The use of drugs and surgery on children is permanent and harmful. There is evidence that without intervention, most of these young people would grow up to be happy in their bodies as lesbians and gay men. I find it criminal and bewildering that our child protection agencies are not questioning this doctrine. Counting Dead Women, these are a series of installations that highlight the murders of women by their violent partners in Australia. There's a cutout shape and a cutout space for each murdered woman in a separate book for each year. This one on the left included a magnifying glass displaying the graph of the diminishing numbers of women's refuges in New South Wales from over 80 down to a handful of specialist services in just 3 years. So I train workers in appropriate responding to women experiencing violence and abuse. And the tactics of abuse from the trans rights activists are the same ones used to control women in their personal relationships. And I'll quickly run through some of them. That's physical and sexual violence, threats and intimidation, verbal violence, gaslighting, threats of suicide, financial and coercive control, minimising and blaming the victim, and using children. I've seen trans-identified males housed in women's refuges, given a villa to themselves, while women with children who are escaping male violence are being advised to sleep in their cars under the bridge. Many trans-identified males have heightened sexual responses that pose serious risks to the women and children staying at the shelters. And in the UK recently, a trans-identified male in a women's refuge murdered another resident, a woman staying there to be safe and protected from male violence. Heads in the Sand uses the Australian crest of the emu and kangaroo, upside down, minus heads, to represent our government's inaction on women's rights to safety. And a bit like what Eileen was talking about, accurate data on violence is really important for the planning of interventions, laws and services for both perpetrators and victims. So counting gender identity instead of sex falsely inflates the rates of female violence and masks the true rates of male violence. So what can we do to resist? So I think it's similar advice to that we give women experiencing violence or trying to escape male violence. We need to name the perps and their tactics, identify our allies and our enemies, speak up when it's safe, use evidence-based research, document everything, use the law where we can, don't engage with them, and pick our battles. Because just as these murders act as a threat to all women, so are the actions of the trans rights activists when they conflate and confuse the sex and gender.